Chapter 12. That night, under a wide blanket of glittering stars, Merwald was garishly alive in celebration. Among the rulers, Queen Baraine would exclaim that its like had never been seen in Pearl Sen. Current spheres floated high above the city. They cast a flashing display of rainbow-hued lights that flared in unison with different tropes of street musicians and the music they played. Terranin instructed several candle evokers in ways to work with Terrell's chemists to produce brilliant, vivid displays of fire and color that filled the night sky. Eldritch sparks of red and green were directed in massive shapes of roses in honor of the day's newlyweds. Golden star spots danced among the streets like fireflies at play. Among hundreds of people, they flitted in and out of clouds of richly aromatic food smoke that enticed everyone. And there were dozens of merchant stalls to answer to the hungry people. There were savory meats and sweet breads. Barrels of mead stood beside equal quantities of Terrell's renowned cold peach tea. There were cheeses pasteurized to different flavors and colors by different Tyrolean farms. And it was all free for those with hunger. Behind the vendors, coordinated into swift teams, torch polymancers moved about, replicating whatever items and ingredients were needed. The merchants gained a chance to fully display their quality and skills. Small vendors would likely rise to prominence and higher demand within the year because of this night. Before the Len estate, and at various points of Merwald, there were raised squares made of glossy wood, able to fit dozens of people at a time. Musicians played cheery and slower music in these places, where the men and women danced long hours away. New and budding romances were quickly developing as they held each other into the cold night. It was the first night that Aimrine and Rylan were allowed to share in a long, closed dance. They selected a floor further into the city so as to not draw attention away from the bride and groom. At least, that is what they would tell anyone who might ask. But there was an unspoken truth that they kept. This was the first night since their own marriage that they were left alone, pressed intimately close for so long. This day, there were no pains of endless current, no demonic pressures, no insistent questions about the past. There were no stressful preparations for the best friend's wedding, no glaring princes, and no people gravely injured. Aimrine's arms were wrapped around Rylan's shoulders, with her hands lost in the thick, raven-black locks of his long hair. His hands were clasped behind her back above her hips. Occasionally his hands would dislodge, and he would slowly caress the middle of her back soothingly. As much as she wanted to close her eyes and lose herself in the sensation, she wanted more to remain transfixed by her favorite feature, his brilliant blue eyes. There is a wooded vale far south and east of Palantir. Even as Rylan described it, the images already filled Aimrine's mind. It was a small place between the borders of two baronies. It was unclaimed. Many people believe that land is haunted, Aimrine cautioned. There came images of crumbling stone, interspaced with long wildflowers and wild oaks, mingled with towering redwoods. It was a temple to the Reaping Fate, more than 2 millennia ago. Sometimes, a lost or reckless soul will come to the ruins for solace or seek answers at the broken altar. It was unnerving to hear Rylan recount histories that were non-existent to historians. He relayed the information with the clarity of having read it in a book only a short while ago. Prophets remembers when everyone forgets. Aimrine borrowed the quote from Rylan's mind. Liane used it often to explain things discovered in the fields. It took him by surprise and he blinked before smiling fondly. Yes, it does. And you believe our new home should be there? Aimrine did not truly have to ask. She saw the image of a modest cottage in her mind. There are villages and farmsteads in the south that were not rebuilt after the war. The families were rescued, but the outer city strains to support them while they remain destitute. Aimrine nodded. There are townships close to the estate, where they continue to fall ill or injure themselves as they labor or forge beyond their endurance. I can convince my father to assign an outpost of legionnaires to keep watch over the people and their well-being. A concentrated and united effort, Rylan simplified. Criminal movements will be severely reduced as well. Aimrine looked down the street, peering over the heads of the celibates. Speaking of legionnaires and suspicious activity, where is Jorikin? Aimrine felt Ryland's mind slip into the temporal current even before she turned and found his eyes closed. His eyelids twitched and shifted as his awareness floated above the streets, among smoke and lights. She envied that he could fly anywhere in the world without leaving her arms. Ryland's eyes opened and narrowed with annoyance. He is still old enough only for peach tea, never mind drinking games. Aimrine leaned her head back in a purl of loud laughter. Did that stop a certain hero of Thrywold, my love? Ryland gave a shy smile as he lowered his eyes with meek embarrassment. I thought that was outside of mention. I have refrained from any drinking antics, as promised. My dear husband, I am your wife. Married women retain clear memories of their husband's wrongdoings so that they are never forgotten or repeated. Ryland smiled and Aimrine felt his acceptance at the reality. It was difficult for Ishel and Borvis to escape the press of Tyrillian nobility or the congratulating rulers of Stratia. Every time Borvis shared a look with her, an unspoken agreement to meld walk away from gushing highborns, Tyrion would appear, seemingly out of thin air. One disapproving glower from her was all it took to halt their endless current. Ishel knew Borvis never truly felt comfortable around the caste he was born into. It wasn't the same as Aimrine, who possessed a better nature than her peers. He started his life as an unruly child, as Zenrik explained it. The bronze statue steadily burning its fuel in a tall bonfire did not let them conceal anything from the people. Ishel simply wanted to get away from this formal setting. She was exhausted in a way that congealed in her body with lethargy. Much of last night was spent in a starting effort to grasp the contents of the vault. When she returned, she spent so much time explaining her absence to worried women that she missed sleep altogether. Ishel looked over at Borvis, staring at his bored, comical expression as he yawned. Current refresh, you look like a dullard, Ishel murmured out of the corner of her mouth as she turned to watch highborn men and women dance. Y'all want to talk, Borvis muttered his retort. Have you glanced at your reflection? You look drained enough to shame the dead. Ishel's lips turned up in an unexpected smirk that bordered on laughter. If that was truly what he thought, why had he spent so much time gaping at her? Borvis snorted a chuckle, apparently of a similar mind, before they both erupted in laughter. Find us a way out of here, Borvis, then, and I will show you how alive I am. Borvis stopped laughing at once. He stammered over a witty reply that would not arrive. His cheeks brightened to the shade of red that only caused Ishel to laugh harder. Not even Ryland blushed this much. Ishel leaned close to Borvis's ear, whispering, I have curiosities that must be satisfied before I am too tired to current refresh. Now, use that clever mind of yours, and find us a way out of prying sight. It had to be just that moment that the dark-haired queen Northea Maisonette peeled free of the tightly packed crowd of nobles to approach them. Ishel cursed the fates in silent chagrin. The tall, slender Katani had high cheekbones and pale, dark complexion of the people of her nation. She chose a modest silver gown of cotton so as to not stand out too much. She abandoned her silver crown, inlaid with pearls, leaving her shoulder-length, gray-streaked black hair unadorned. At last, a moment with the fates-favored newlyweds, Northea cheerfully exclaimed as she spread her arms to gather them in an embrace. And with two of Catanshaw's greatest benefactors. A better match was never made. Ishel and Borvis bowed low. Your Majesty, they joined in greeting. The musician struck a garish tune, and Northea did away with the formalities, bringing them in close and tight. She laughed. I am certain the maps will inform me that this is Terrell. You may call me Thea. Thea moved in closer, feigning a congratulatory kiss on the cheek as she whispered, You both look frightful, and equally ready to shred each other's attire to ribbons here and now. If you have an escape, you are woefully late to execute it. Borvis and Ishel looked at each other with confusion, and Thea read their expressions and rolled her eyes. Fates, she murmured in a gasp. A wedding celebration that spans the city just before a ruler's summit, and neither of you planned away free? Solus Ishel, I understand. She is not noble-born and would not know. But Borvis Altivilen, you should know these things. Ishel's eyes widened as she giggled. Altivi? You didn't even tell her your ancestral heart name? Thea tisked thrice. Borvis pinched the bridge of his long, pointed nose and groaned. I deliberately never told her. Yours is one of the last families old enough to have a heart name. Thea poked a finger into his chest. That name was concocted with all the verbal grace and sensibilities of a dying cow, Borvis protested. The queen rolled her eyes and sighed before she leaned close again. Now, you're already much later to depart than any other bride and groom I have ever seen. So follow my lead, and be gone with haste. There were questions Ishel had for the queen, but Thea gave her no chance. She turned and immediately began a lengthy coughing fit. She doubled over as her cheeks quickly turned purple. The response was just as quick. All eyes and attention turned to the struggling queen. The cheery music fell to silence against an immediate wave of concerned mutterings. Ternan shoved her way through the nobles with all the regard of a bull in a wheat field. She slapped Thea's back several times before pulling her to lay on the ground for better examination, but not before slipping a private wink for Borvis and Ishel. Borvis grabbed Ishel's hand, and the ease at which they dipped low and eased through the throng of people surprised Ishel. Borvis moved into a sliding maneuver that was matched only by the dances he had with her earlier. Ishel was already jealous of her husband's graceful displays of movement. As she danced with him earlier, she crushed the toes of a baron and clumsily slipped sideways twice. Graceful was clearly not a matching description for her. The bride and groom emerged at the beginning of an eastward street. The colorful night fires boomed like thunder as they continued to fill the sky with vivid bursts. Down a street to the north, Ishel saw images of light distilled like paintings crafted on an easel of air. But a faint flow of endless current in the east drew Ishel's attention. She spared a moment of staring and found Rylan and Amarine dancing close in an intimate embrace to a particularly slow song. Rylan was having no trouble dancing with his noble-born wife, and it quickly became apparent why. That little cheat! Ishel laughed as she accused. He's using their bond in simulacrum to move like the better dancer she knows among men. Borvis wrapped his arms around Ishel from behind. His closeness filled her with a buzzing, and the thick tickle of his breath and his long nose brushed her neck soon washed away all her envy and random thoughts. Shall we go back into our auto robes and be on our way to Perol-Glay? Borvis whispered seductively. But Ishel had other ideas. She enjoyed the glances he nervously dared at her today. There was no need for him to hesitate to look at her. She wanted to force him to stare at length, to allow his eyes to take her in as he wished. She wanted his eyes to start the path on her that his hands would follow. Tonight, that was because she wanted to do exactly that herself. Ishel moaned as she closed her eyes and leaned her neck against his lips and nose. Borvis Len, by the fates, those clothes are not to leave your body until I rip them off you. But we'd better leave now, because if you persist as you are now... She moaned with another surge of electric pleasure as he kissed her neck several more times. I will have to take you, here, and now. Borvis pulled away, still holding Ishel's hand as the endless current rushed to him. He looked at her with a heated smile. How could she remain clear enough to shape a meldwalk? Ishel was lightheaded with a desire that would not wait long. Her impatience was rewarded when the city of Merwald and the Terulian countryside melted into a kaleidoscope of mad, dark colors. Through the meldwalk, Ishel kept her gaze on Borvis's brown eyes. He instinctively halted the meldwalk when the dark colors were replaced with a glossy white color. It was late at night in Perol-Glay, well past midnight by several hours. The gleaming broad rainbow avenues were empty. The island flower beds were little more than dark shadows filling the air with cool, sweet fragrances. The water fountains were further away, but the water gurgled and gave a sense of tranquility. Borvis looked to the right and pointed to one of the few domes that still poured light from its windows. It was one of the few inns that would remain open for new patrons at so late an hour. It was a rarity in any nation, but after the scars of the eclipse, it was a wonder that any inn of Perol-Glay would be open so late. Ishel tried to peer into the dark as curiosity took a momentary hold over her longing. The capital city was one of the first to suffer the brunt of the Kassaran wrath in their final assault. Dozens of innocent lives were butchered within minutes. It was said and agreed upon by Moral that in the darkness, everything below 10 feet was bathed in carnage. The White City was pockmarked and painted red with the blood that dyed the fountains. How had the people fared in healing such horrible wounds? Erisa claimed that the people stood together, wanting to hear all manner of their pains united. To their credit, Ishel saw no trace of that bloody night now. Ishel allowed Borvis to lead the way to the inn. It was a quiet place several floors tall. It had wide ivory balconies decorated with pots of flowers, surrounding private round alabaster tables. Though Ishel would not have said as much any other day, she thought the inn looked sweet and inviting. They paid the innkeeper from a coin purse Borvis kept on hand. He always maintained a variety of national currencies. Ishel adopted that practice as well. The innkeeper was a middle-aged man with hawk-like eyes. He was observant enough to recognize their freshly married status. He promptly insisted they use the broad suite on the top floor. When Borvis opened the door for Ishel, she thought she should have argued for something modest, but the huge bed with tall ivory posts and red silk canopies looked too comfortable for her to dismiss. A cool breeze blew in front of the balcony through the wide glass double doors. The wind parted the red silk to reveal a white downy mattress and a fluffed stack of pillows. Would she be able to stay awake for her desires? Ishel looked back at Borvis as he entered and closed the door. She eyed him up and down as he looked at her. She let the surge of desire fill her as it did when he held her close. Oh yes, sleep could wait. Ishel waited only a moment more. She stood close in front of him, forcing him to look at her, to want her as much as she wanted him. His mouth gaped slightly as his breath caught in his throat. Weeks ago, Taranin pulled Ishel into a private discussion. The Pyromaster was aware of her naivety for intimacy. Taranin explained it to her and remedied this at length. It was a very detailed lesson, causing Ishel to blush relentlessly. But Taranin would not ease up, and the room was as heated as Ishel's father's forge and Taranin's heart fire combined. But Taranin also wagered that Borvis knew as little as Ishel did. A smart coin says his bravado was just words. Taranin's advice echoed in Ishel's mind. Oftentimes, women are better at leading in these situations. Ishel reached for Borvis's wide-brimmed hat, throwing it aside and left him no moment. Her fingers clasped behind his head in his short, brown, unruly hair. She yanked him to her in a fiercely heated kiss and did not allow either of them to breathe. This was also something Taranin instructed her on. When Borvis's hands wrapped around her hips, sliding across her snug bodice, all thoughts were gone from Ishel. Only her body would drink in sensations of pleasure and passion for the rest of the night and into the first rays of the morning. Chapter 13. Maurice was exhausted, but that did not mean he had slept. 2 days before he and Nerlise departed Serol, he spared only minutes for rest. His light gray pants and tunic were as stained and wrinkled as his gray torch robes. He focused all his time and energy on the emaciated and forgotten children that lay sick in the streets. There were dozens of children that would not have survived 2 more days unattended. Their raspy breaths still echoed in his ear like a twisted song that he could not erase. He closed his eyes and still saw the way their skin pulled tight over their ribs. He saw the pus-filled sores surrounded by scrapes oozing dry, thin blood. The children of Vodus were a different kind of reflection of their ruler. They were a sight that cut Maurice deep, filling his being with silent, sympathetic rending. When it was time to leave Serol, Nerlise insisted that the now lucid king should walk with them to the edge of the city before meldwalking. Maurice heartedly agreed, and the rest was as expected. As much as Kelman Forzen trembled in his new state of freedom, his conscience made him shiver with barely contained sobs at the suffering he permitted. There were no poppies and opium to carry him away from the cruel truth. Reality had waited a long time to force him to this moment, and it would not be denied.
What have I done?
Kelman's voice quivered. Nothing you can't change if you hold the will, Your Majesty. Neralise's tone was flat and hard. Even now, as Maurice sat in the wooden chair at the window, the sadness and regret of the king's voice also filled his mind. Coming to Merwold and the celebration they held was an escape that struck Maurice with guilt. He bottled it inside in silence, unwilling to erode the cheer of others. But he wanted to go back to Serral and finish what he started. The decision was not in his hands. He had little other reasonable choice than to let the matter be for now. During the celebration, Maurice remained close to Merral. The dawn light gathered crowds of children as he recounted historic stories and revered legends. Maurice never knew the archivist had such a skill for dramatic storytelling, but his Perali national spirit revealed itself and he quickly captivated people of every kind. Maurice contributed with massive conjured images of color and light. He maintained a current read on Meral's thoughts and projected the images in his mind in tandem with the story. Maurice was neither surprised or disappointed that Merral steered the recounting away from void hands and demons. The Solus was haunted with dark memories, even as he was forced to wade deep into troubled historic events. The sound of loud snoring filled the second floor inn room. The geomancer Jolton slept soundly in one of the two plain beds. They were part of a handful of younger lights who earned the privilege of attending the wedding ceremony and the celebration that followed. Maurice smiled and chuckled slightly as Jolton's round shape rose and fell in slow rhythm beneath the covers. The other rooms were occupied by torch and candle boys, while Rylan, Merral, and Lauren slept in separate rooms on the floor below. Only two of the candles complained that the ladies of the order were staying in the Len estate. Tomorrow, during the ruler's summit, Maurice knew that Merral would declare Ishel as the new Grand Illumination. He knew this because the spirits of the barrier told him that the vault's magic had chosen her. It was a good choice. Maurice followed the evoker into war, and he was following her guidance into what he believed would be a better era. So, as Maurice watched the bright orange torchlight of the wedding brazier at the heart of Merwold, one question came to mind. Why did the spirits of the barrier believe it might be anything other than a better era? Ryland slept soundly, but his dreams were a vast, empty void of darkness. The cold of this place seeped into his sleeping body. He wondered why he did not wake from discomfort. His shivers and frostbitten fingers and toes stung his sleeping body. In his dreams, clouds of white formed with every breath before they were devoured in the infinite darkness. Before anything else could transpire, Ryland already knew this to be a machination of hell. This wasn't sulphurist. There was no mad or frightened cries of the condemned, none of the scraping claws and the low growls of demonic predators. Ryland was watched, though. A hidden glare of contempt and hatred kept his baleful gaze locked on him. Ryland knew this hidden figure. After so many lesser demons, it was a surprise that this one should arrive so soon. Your Majesty, Ryland inclined with his head in a slight bow. His tone dripped with a thick trace of sarcasm.
Formalities are not required of thee, Creoten.
The voice of Marrowweave, King of Hell, was a chilling blend of a low growl and a raspy whisper. Ryland shoved down his own shoulders and shivers with a surge of angry will, allowing him to speak blunt. What do you want, Marrowweave?
I had no desire to speak with Ryland to care, the Chronomancer.
Marrowweave spit the name and title with disgust.
I have only ever sent my missives to seek with the champion of the Great Mother.
You send paltry messages with the focus of a fly. Ryland's attempt to insult and provoke was met only with loud, inhuman laughter.
Foolish, irrelevant Magus Warden. Doth thou believe I wrestled the crown of hell by submitting to crass, unintelligible insults? If thou believest that I sent communications without thought, thou art woefully unprepared to stand this ground. The torrent swimmer, as thou stupidly calleth, was a pointed note.
Ryland suppressed his confusion with a flat tone. Was it now? Marrowweave's voice was a lower growl than before.
Thou doth deny thy true self. Thou doth allow injustice to fester across thy land, when the time to cut free this cancer eludes thee. Justice and reckoning is thy blade alone. It calls thee. Do not drown and die beyond thy purpose and greatness. Thou must cometh to embrace that which thou art.
The hairs on the back of Maurice's neck raised with warning, while the air chilled to freezing. All was not well. Something sinister was about to transpire. Every 12-year-old impulse within Maurice screamed at him to leap off the bed, throw the covers over himself, and hide away from the monster that stalked him in the night. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead and arms. His brown eyes were wide. It was several hours past midnight, a time that was ripe for the oppressors of the underworld to reach into Provis with the black hands of wraiths. But Maurice would not comply with these childlike impulses. He reined in his growing terror by slowing his rapid breathing. He was an Chronomancer long before he could be just another boy. Demons would only sense his fear and weaponize it to cause greater destruction. He knew this because Ulysses, a master Chronomancer, taught him this, and he had battled dozens of demons while he lived. As a spirit mentor, he bequeathed all his knowledge to Maurice. This would be the first time the young torch stood in conflict against a demon. But he doubted it would be the last unless he allowed his fears to take his life. The wooden chair on the other side of the tall window wobbled, its legs rapping against the hard floor. It wobbled twice more before it slid several feet towards Jolton's bed. Maurice's bowels ran cold as he investigated the darkness where the Geomancer slept. Above the boy's face, a long gleaming steel dagger hovered in midair, its sharp point aimed at Jolton's forehead. He continued to sleep, unaware of the danger. The moment his eyes opened, Maurice knew his screams would mark the end of his life. Any sudden movement from Maurice would also result in killing the Geomancer. And yet, the demon itself was not in the room. Demons such as this could not stretch their power far beyond the reach of their shape and form. Before Maurice could begin the search for the demon, and he would find it, he would have to eliminate the threat to Jolton. Maurice slowed his breath further, even while his body was rigid and tense. A trickle of his random thoughts was permitted to obstruct the full potency of the endless current. The demon would sense anything too large and plunge the dagger before he could react. Maurice did not know how a dagger was in the room at all. But then again, demonic manipulation was far-reaching and calculated. It would not be surprising to find dozens more poised in the air above the beds of his fellow lights, or the unsuspecting residents of Merwold. Maurice's hidden index finger twitched only a hair at a time, while his words never climbed over the sight and sound of his breathing. He shaped his elumancy one bit at a time, careful to appear that he was sitting terrified and still, nothing more. The dagger lowered slowly. Its point trembled slightly. It was so close to the skin of Jolton's forehead. Somehow, the Geomancer continued to sleep, oblivious to the threat. Maurice would have no choice in one instant more. It would become a matter of who moved first. His spell shape would have to be ready. Jolton's eyes opened. Maurice sprang to his feet, toppling the chair. He snapped the spell shape into place just as the tip of the dagger touched Jolton's forehead. Everything happened in a lightning-quick instant. Jolton screamed, and Maurice unleashed an all-encompassing white light that flared in the room. The blinding light brought a deafening boom and hurled the dagger against the door. Half the blade sank into the wood. A low animal growl sounded as the light faded from the room. The walls began to ooze thin rivulets of blood. Jolton sat up in his bed, his eyes shifting about the panic. "Fates!" His voice was a frightened whisper. "What is this?" Maurice shrugged, feigning ignorance. "An angry ghost, I think." The rancid, rotten egg stench of sulfur permeated the cold air. There was little time for Maurice to act. "I don't think this is just our room, Light Jolton. We need to make sure everyone is safe. It may not be limited to just the inn either." Jolton's look was dumbfounded. Are you sure?" Maurice gave Jalton an exasperated look and an annoyed glare. Have you ever been threatened by a ghost holding a blade over your head before? Jalton nodded with slow understanding. Go upstairs, gather Light Rufik and Light Dainir, and all of you protect the candles. I will go find the Solas. Maurice did not wait for a sign of compliance, but the door refused to open. He turned the knob, but it would not release from the frame, and he refused to wait for that either. Several fearful screams were coupled with agonized cries outside, charging Maurice with urgency. He gathered his will into his bowels and shoved forward with both hands. A ball of pure force slammed into the door and shattered it into chunks. He ran down the hall and sprinted down the steps, 3 at a time. The walls of the inn quaked, forcing Maurice to stumble. A massive oak cabinet was hurled into view at the bottom of the steps, nearly crashing into him. He leapt over the obstacle in one smooth motion and arrived at pandemonium. Chairs and tables were hurled around, windows were shattered, knives and quills dashed through the air with deadly promise. Wind and howling force toppled down everything standing. Maurice halted, slowing his breathing and removing any panic from his thoughts. He reached into his robe, retrieving a sanded wooden inch-long cylinder attached to the end of a woven length of finely braided horsehair. He held the woven threads up by his thumb and index finger, allowing the wood to dangle. He pitched and slid 2 fingers on his other hand down the thread, stilling its wayward movements and infusing it with his will. The first step was to locate the demon using the pendulum. The stronger the ghostly event, the closer he was to the demon. At this point, his concentration and will be his only shield between the demonic chaos and the swaying peace of Yew-Wood. If he faltered, the demon would rip it out of his hands. There were, of course, magi across the breadth of Provis with a unique ability to view incorporeal beings with the naked eye. Maurice did not know what caused this ability, but he envied those who possessed it. Maurice stepped forward while the pendulum swayed ahead. He turned out the deadly barrage around him as he pressed forward with slow steps. When it began to swing left across the broad den and toward a hall, he walked into it. In the hall, far from the Sola's room, the pendulum swung in broad circles, signaling that he was within several feet of the demon. Maurice raised his eyes but saw nothing in the hall. Moral and Lauren were beginning to gather the endless current. If Maurice did not do something impossible to ignore, the 2 Solas would trace the assault to Rylan being involved in some way. Maurice gathered a roaring wave of endless current and stomped his foot. A shockwave of white light and force blasted out from the point of impact and rippled across the inn floor. Moral and Lauren stepped out of their rooms with the open expressions of bewilderment. Maurice extracted a gull feather and a beach pebble from the pocket of his robe. He touched an open space of air in front of him twice. A fingertip-sized ball of crystalline water and another ball of bright orange fire sprang to life, floating in the air before him. Maurice slapped his forehead with self-berating frustration before he remembered to shape a current sphere of white light above his head. Between the expended efforts of the demonic attack and the wave of light, there was no chance for the demon to escape into hiding now. Maurice opened his palm. The feather and stone floated into the air, taking their place with water and flame. Fire burn thee, Maurice shouted as the flame dashed ahead. Water drown thee, earth bury thee, and wind grant thee rending tempest. The objects dashed into an orbital perimeter. The flames flared. The water sprayed in a torrent. The floor was broken by jagged spikes of stone, and a howling funnel of wind swept with fury. Maurice pointed at the center of the elemental storm, and his current sphere lanced into a snare with a beam of white light and energy. The demon shrieked as the light ripped away at its collected dark strength. All is known in the light! Maurice shouted the innotation, as a powerful command far beyond his years. Moral and Lawrence stepped to flank at either side of Maurice, joining their gathered endless current to the Chronomancer. Their words and their power united to obliterate the hellish intruder. The light exiles the shadows! The words and light ripped every iota of the demon apart. An explosion of light and force blasted with a sound like thunder, amplified and set loose inside the inn. Everything was bathed in a flare of blinding white light. Nothing was permitted to cast a shadow. And then it all faded. Maurice's ears rang and his breathing labored. Papers and debris listed lazily back down to the surface. In the silence, Merle gripped Maurice by the shoulders and turned him to face the Aeromancer. His eyes were wide. "No one could have taught you that," Merle breathed. Maurice's eyes drooped with exhaustion. "I am tired, Spark Merle. May we speak of it later in the day?" Merle's head tilted in a suspicious stare, but he nodded. "That is well enough, Light Maurice. But we shall speak of this. Make no plans to belay that." Maurice stumbled clumsily to the stairs. Ulyssean's instructions made the 5-element banishing ritual sound so easy. But Maurice could not remember the last time he was so depleted. The healer's triage during the war was not so taxing as this. Sleep would come with ease now. To further exhaust Maurice, he remembered that Ulyssean's spirit expected him to master the ritual to rapid ease and create new and more powerful variations of it. Chapter 14. Ishel spewed another meal into the large steel bucket. She was on her knees as Borvis stood beside her, holding up her hair. He maintained a discreet silence, speaking only when a wave of vomiting passed for a few long moments. It was the smell for certain. Ishel didn't know what the bakers were mixing into their bread, but it was horrible. Wasn't Pearl Glay known for sweeter, more enticing fragrances? It coupled with her own sickness, and that made it so much worse. A wave of nausea passed. Ishel allowed cool air into her gaping mouth. She did not dare to breathe through her nose. "Are the bakers reusing their own refuse?" Ishel complained, hating how whiny it sounded. "We could transmute it to something more practical, and a lot less foul." Borvis offered a nervous chuckle. "The nearest bakery is a mile to the south of here, love." Ishel looked up at Borvis, glaring accusingly, before a wave of ache seized her back and legs. She cried out unintelligibly, before Borvis swept her up in one arm and gently led her back to the bed. Ishel wiped away a tiny stream of drool mixed with vomit on her chin. "I am certain I felt better after the Phoenix Legion bought a night full of meat for Light Ryland and I," she complained. The severe ailment made no sense to Ishel and could not be worse timed. The past several days barely saw the newly lit lights outside the inn room. They might have walked a few times during several different times of the day to see Pearl Glay in varied forms of beauty under the sun. Ishel was certain Borvis had the same hungering desire to return to their inn room. The first night, tiredness could not keep them from exploring each other. Ishel held her breath with his every touch. She touched him in return and was seized with an electric impulse to do so much more. As he touched, she guided his hands, helping him to elicit more from her. Borvis spent years telling everyone how he knew how to please women, but his hands admitted to Ishel that there were some boundaries he was careful not to cross in his younger years. Borvis spent his early years escaping tutors and teachers in his father's estate and running to taverns. He might not have been old enough to drink or gamble, but he was bold and nearly shameless in his approach to ladies, though most of his learning was from girls his own age. Zenrik was at no shortage of angry fathers who wanted the Baron to rein his son in. Ishel could only imagine the sigh of relief he must have had when it was discovered that Borvis held noticeable potential for sorcery. But, even taught by several sparks and watched carefully, Borvis still found ways to continue his flirtatious and lecherous patterns in towns like Tilzen. What was only kisses and groping before quickly became experiments with his discoveries in polymancy, and listening close when the young ladies he seduced told him private things. It was still clumsy at first. It wasn't entirely Borvis's fault, and he learned in a matter of hours. Ishel sometimes imagined what it might be like to have the personal affections of a polymancer. The reality was far better than Ishel could have imagined. In the first night, she was the bold one, claiming him without hesitation. But he learned all the places on her body that would draw the most reaction, and his polymancy allowed him to change his own body to better play at those places. The result, the following 2 days, was a sheer level of ecstasy that made her legs wobble, as though gelatinous left her lower lip sore from hard biting, and she wasn't sure when the first clear and lucid thought came to her mind. So how was she sick now?
We should delay the summit then. They can let you rest.
Borvis voiced the suggestion with a hard, uncharacteristic edge. Ishel looked at his expression and read a mix of sympathy and concern. But Ishel shook her head.
It was already delayed by several days because of the attack on the inn at night. The people of Stratia need the order and the rulers to form plans and act on their behalf. They have waited too long already. Like Ishel then, the summit is set for 1 hour from now. I do not know how you are so ill, but you are unable to stay away from the pail for more than a pitch of an hourglass. How will you sit still and think for several hours?
Ishel sat her jaw as she pondered her options.
The summit is taking place in the dining hall of your father's estate. I can meet with Lipora, and we can treat this ailment. Very well, love. But I hold a question I believe we should both consider.
Ishel nodded her understanding. She was too fatigued to voice something quite so lengthy. But his unspoken question was clear. How was she ill at all? Sickness was all but optional for any magus with competence in handling the endless current. The radiant vibrations of creation pouring through any one being scoured away any deterrents like sickness. It allowed faster healing and greater longevity. Outside of drunken revelry, no magus should ever kneel before a bucket.
Questions for a hydromancer with healing proficiencies, Liporvis?
Ishel stood up and felt her back protest with a wave of cramps while her legs wobbled. The room spun in her vision. She willed her cast iron staff into her hand. Borvis raised another doubtful eyebrow.
I will shape the Meldwalk. Are you certain of this, love?
Ishel managed a weak smile and caressed the side of his stubbled cheek.
I am certain, my love. I can do this and will do this because it must be done. I need no other motivation.
Borvis sighed but put his gray robe on over his yellow tunic and black breeches. He held out his hand and summoned his applewood staff, etched with rose patterns and enchanted for iron durability. Borvis shaped the return Meldwalk in less than a thought, and they traveled back to Merwold. Ishel hoped for a moment to take stock of the attack on the inn. There were a lot of careful omissions, and that nagged at her. But no sooner that they arrived at the gate of the estate did a squad of blue and chainmail-clad Phoenix Legionnaires fall into step to escort them. They were led by the Dunnel garrison captain, Ronkar Meraxis, who she met assisting Terranin during the war. If all went as Ishel hoped, the captain and the pyromancer would work closely with each other for a long time.
How fares Dunnel, Captain Meraxis?
Ishel asked. The captain looked like he wished to run a nervous hand through his hair, but answered with stoic discipline. One hand on the pommel of his broadsword while the other was strapped with a steel kite shield. Ishel's father Ernik had been very busy assisting in the outfitting of every legion recruit, and the captain's armament was no exception.
The rebuilding is a trial. The Red Fiends burned down the homes in spite when they couldn't find us. The families come home one at a time, so that our few builders have had the time they need to construct cabins.
Ishel nodded, but all this presented Malkinor was an unspoken problem. Malaric Morinroke would be too proud and honorable to voice it without proper nudging.
Begging your pardon, Solus Ishelen,
the captor ventured tentatively.
But you appear under the weather.
Ishel smiled.
Is it so clear, Captain? I had hoped you wouldn't notice.
The captain pointed a meaningful peripheral look at her.
Whatever you may require, I, or my men, will fetch it.
If it was so simple, Captain, I would have done it already, Borvis grumbled,
earning an elbow to the ribs from Ishel.
I only need to speak with Lipora and Knight Terranin before we begin.
Ronkar gave an eager smile.
I need little reason to fetch the White Phoenix.
Ishel replied with a low chuckle. The Phoenix Legion dubbed Terranin as one of their own long ago.
They gave her a rather appropriate nickname for her signature heartfires. She saved them at the Battle of Dunel, and she stood with them on the mesa aboard Cray. Captain Meraxis was among her most stalwart supporters. The captain led them to the entry foyer. It was a cavernous room, circled by a railed balcony that joined at a broad stairway at the far end of the room. Brass candlestands and glass tables gleamed with polish as sunlight poured in from massive windows facing east. It was much too large for the practical sensibilities of the recent Len barony, but it was also an ancestral estate. If they had as much cause as Malkinor or Votus, they would have auctioned it all away. The foyer itself used to host small masquerades and gatherings for ancient Tyrillian noble houses. Captain Ronkar departed with a deep bow, leaving for a door on the upper floor. Minutes later, Terranin and Pora rushed through with worried expressions. No word was given before they grabbed Ishel and yanked her into a private windowless antechamber. It was a cramped space as Terranin and Pora began to rub and press at her without preamble. The space became uncomfortable and claustrophobic. At last, Terranin stepped back. She rubbed her chin with a scarred hand and her brow furrowed in thought. Pora potted Ishel a few moments more before she looked at the pyromancer deferentially. "Nausea?" Terranin asked. Ishel's answer was simple. "I cannot keep a meal down." "Tired?" Ishel nodded. "Aches all over like a fever?" Ishel nodded once again. "I've wondered what that felt like." Terranin ignored that comment as she nodded, still deep in thought. "There is more I can ask, but let's arrive at the point in haste." Without another word of warning, the endless current flowed to Terranin and her hands radiated a glow red warmth. A tiny ember glow filled her brown eyes. The way she bent to Ishel's belly, pressing her palms, was a little intrusive, but Ishel knew better than to protest. With no exit for the heat, Ishel began to sweat before Terranin straightened. "As I thought, and I should know," Terranin breathed. "You are with child, Light Ishel." "That can't be." Pora voiced Ishel's thoughts with a mirroring incredulity. "She has been married but a few days. The signs cannot be that swift." "In normal women, perhaps." Terranin did not look away from Ishel as she was unfazed. "But the older journal states that a sorceress will show signs at an accelerated rate. The endless current is ever eager to usher in new life." Pora shook her head, trying to dispel her disbelief. "Supposing this is true, why are there no recent mentions? What else can we expect?" Ishel wanted to add her own thoughts of improbability, but she only managed a slight hyperventilating. Though she was the subject of the two healers' conversation, they talked while seeming ignorant of her. "For one thing, sorceresses have always dedicated to the Order and its cause for centuries. Union and marriage were never a consideration for them. But the accelerated signs are another reason. They can be frightening, even to ponder." Ishel would no longer stay out of this conversation. "What signs frighten them? What can I expect, Light Terranin?" "The signs you have already experienced are some. They come early and they last longer. But with the strength that you and Light Bolvis hold, you can expect this at every turn. But this also forms the certainty that the child will be born healthy and hale. But you must also be wary of your mood and your powers. You may lash out without warning, and without control." That was alarming, and Ishel understood why women of the Order did not take such risks. "Does that mean the child will be born early?" It was a fearful question, filled with images in her mind of growing larger by minutes. Terranin shook her head. "Such haste on the human body would be disastrous, even for a sorceress. There are some aspects that must be followed to life's natural course, and that is one of them." "You were speaking of old books, Light Terranin. But did you not have a son as well?" Pora tried to phrase it as gently as possible, but there was little tact to be had in the delicate manner. Terranin gritted her teeth a moment before she attempted to answer. Ishel knew the pyromancer confronted her loss once already, but there were some pains that would leave scars forever. "I lived unaware of the endless currents. until after they passed on. My body was normal until then, and so was my birthing my Caden.
Ternan quickly changed the subject.
This is another dreaded point of sorceresses, Light Isha. You will have to endure more in carrying your child, and you will be forbidden to hasten any part of it. You may not cleanse your body of any of the coming ailments, and you may not current refresh to contend with your pain and fatigue. Any attempts of either may result in harm to the child.
Isha wanted to sit down just then, but there were no chairs or benches in the cramped room. She heavily leaned on the black iron of her shelf, resting her forehead against the cool, pearly surface of the lightning bolt, shutting her eyes. Ternan wrapped her arms around Ishel's shoulders.
No one will allow you to endure this alone, Light Ishel.
Ishel remembered the Pyromaster saying the very same thing several years ago during the war.
It is important that you do not strain or fret. Your child needs your calm and tranquility.
Ishel turned one eye open to Ternan.
You will soon know that calm and tranquility are two ideals far out of my reach.
Pora chimed in brightly.
At least unity is not.
Isha was already familiar with the large dining hall and many of its occupants. Its rectangular shape and the towering windows facing the east reminded her of a polished wood version of the throne room in Palanzar. But there were no wide stone columns here, and in place of a long red carpet, there was a long redwood rectangular table. Isha walked behind Maral, among the other souls. Her father was already seated against the wall behind Malaric. Talek sat at one end of the table, his auburn-haired, willowy wife sitting beside him to the right. Zenrik and Serenthia Len sat to his left. The rest of the right side, close to the wall, was reserved for the newly arrived Solus. Ishel took a moment to assess the other rulers. Northia Maisoness sat sedate and demure with her hands clasped on the table before her. Then there was the petite, fair-wide figure of Berain Darren. The tiny young Parali Queen fidgeted nervously, while the folds of her ivory-white silk gown and its gold thread embroidery. The red-haired Solus Arissa laid a steadying hand on the young queen's arm, and it looked like that was all that was keeping the wide-eyed woman from bolting into town screaming. Beside Arissa, Nerylise pressed constantly, monitoring tendrils of her aromancy into the shaky king beside her. He looked healthier than the last two reports stated of him. He was clean-shaven, his sandy beard was washed and combed. His skin wasn't so close to his bones, and his cheeks were a little less sunken and sallow. His complexion was still pale and pasty, but so much had been done already. Kelman Forzen, for all his quaking and hand-wringing, appeared to be a king ready to set things right with his nation. Maral stepped forward, approaching the table and its rulers before speaking in a raised, resonant voice.
If your majesties would please, I would like to begin by relinquishing my role as leader of the Order of the Enlightened Sun. I will continue to contribute, but only in an assisting capacity.
Thea asked the obvious question.
Who will act as leader in your place, Dawnlight?
Maral stepped aside and gestured for Ishel to step forward. She prayed her nausea would leave her be, just for a while longer.
I have personally trained Light Ishel for the role. In accordance with our traditions, she has been acknowledged as Grand Illumination.
There were cleared throats and varied expressions passed among the barons and rulers. To everyone's surprise, Kelman Forzen spoke next in a quaking voice.
Begging your pardon, Solus Maral, but she is so young and not an odd Solus.
Solus Ishel, then, has long since proven her world experience,
Malaric drawled patiently.
I believe Talek would agree that she was instrumental in surviving of both our nations during the invasion. And there is not a man among my legion who would not vouch for the Stormsmith.
Marcellus interjected from behind Malaric. Ishel forgot that Terranin was not the only one who earned a nickname among the Fijian legionnaires. It was a while since she had last heard it.
Please, Your Radiance, sit and advise us.
Thea gestured at a seat at the opposite end of the table from Talek. Ishel accepted her place, but could not afford to waste moments on formalities.
I would first like to advise on the circumstances of the refugees still destitute in Palantir and economic solutions to see them home and well.
It was blunt and swiftly edged, which left some of the barons stricken. Thea smiled and spoke first.
It is my understanding that New Catan waits for residents and a governing body. There are rumors of a dozen merchants and fishing ships moored at the docks.
Ishel nodded.
That is correct, Your Majesty. Though Light, Borvis and Rylan believe it is only in an initial stage. We can send a team to Meldwalk the Catani people to their new home. That is generous, but it won't be necessary, Your Radiance. Many of the people fled to our own capital during the war. They have been merely waiting for the word. That is all well and good, but what about the rest of us, Northea?
Moraine interjected, shrinking in on herself when everyone looked at her with surprise. It was clear that Orissa was quick to encourage the young ruler to speak up.
Pirali Gley is filled with hundreds of survivors, but it's the only city we have left. I fear we do not have the people or resources to retain our sovereignty.
Ishel pondered that dilemma for many weeks now. The Order could build city after city and bolster the vitality of Province to provide rich amounts of resources. But the one thing the Order could not restore and bolster was the lost human lives. Due to being the landing ground of the invasion, Peral Sen lost more people in the war than any other land. If not for the quick thinking and fortuitous timing of Moral and a handful of other Solas, there would not be enough living Pirali to count on one hand. There was a solution, but Ishel already knew what complaints she might meet.
The problems you face, Your Majesty,
Ishel directed her attention at Berain,
is not isolated to your nation alone. It also does not begin with the invasion. Our histories have recorded great catastrophes, brutal warfare, and an assortment of predatory individuals who stalk whoever they may. Our response has been less than favorable for prosperity, and we have repeated it to deadly effect.
Ishel turned her gaze to Talik.
What is Terrell known for, Your Majesty?
We are a farming nation, of course.
But Malkinor has fields for farming, does it not?
Talik's expression was bewildered.
It does. But farming is a Tyrillian specialty. We have been known for it for thousands of years.
When the Kasserans arrived, this exclusive nature was as exploited as Peral Sen's singular artistic focus.
It was a blunt and harsh way to phrase it, but Ishel needed them to see the need for these changes.
For millennia, we have relied on one each nation to provide one function.
Ishel pointed at Thea.
We have relied on Catan Shah to protect us from threats from the sea. Terrell has been our only breadbasket. Peral Sen has an army of lancers, but they were never fully trained.
Ishel stood up, shoving her determination against the waves of Aches.
Rulers of Stratia, we stand at a crossroads. On one hand, we do as we always have, and we march to an inevitable extinction. On the other hand, we share strength and knowledge. We unite as a people, and we become a force even the fates cannot deny. It was true that during the war, when the renegades united with the Phoenix Legion, we were greatly outnumbered, and their experience was far beyond our own.
Ishel allowed a moment for that to fully sink in.
I propose that our nations and borders remain only as a formality for now. I propose that we allow people and masses of trade to be shared elements for our lands until such a time as the 6 nations can stand on their own.
6?
Kelman snorted incredulously.
Narinmore must be made habitable, and the Obsidian Throne must have a good ruler.
Ishel pressed with a determined edge.
We must learn from one another and create chances even for the miners who endanger themselves in the northern wastes.
Talik spoke in challenge.
That is a lot of uniting and growing. But we cannot monitor and push this forward with the few people we have now!
Alone you cannot, true enough, Ishel agreed. You will need the Order to aid you, as it has in Malkinor.
Berain surprised everyone with an observation.
One at a time, Your Radiance. There are even fewer lights than there are in Pirali. You cannot aid us all at the same time. and when you leave, your efforts will likely erode.
Ishel shared a look with Orissa, who shrugged. Ishel hated to think so ill of the dead, but perhaps the Sindric was the weight that held down Peral Sen's true great ruler.
We cannot be everywhere at the same time. I propose we permit chapter houses in each nation. We can swiftly recruit and train potential magi, and we can avoid the need for another inquiry.
A stir of murmurs filled the dining hall, but it was Marcellus that challenged Ishel next.
As it was during the age of the mage clans?
Ishel was stunned momentarily. Much of that history was trickled into the public from the vault's first chapter. Marcellus smiled knowingly.
You forget, your radiance, that the Tecares and the Morinrokes retained what were once thought were just legends. Now, if you recall, the mage clans suffered from barely restrained hostilities and infighting. How will you avoid repeating history?
Ishel nearly smiled at that. She thought Marcellus was striking down her idea at first. But now she could see the Lord General was opening the door for her success.
We avoid repeating by doing exactly as the nations must do. We must all unite and share in our fate. No longer will there be one place with its own specialty. We will not have the Dragon Tooth revel in battle, while the Emerald Spectre falls ill as part of their sacrifice to commune with the dead.
Marcellus smirked ever so slightly as a low shared murmur of agreements answered. So Malaric would be the one to bring forward the largest matter.
Then it is time we address the dragons in our face. Demons! Void hands!
Before Ard Solis Martellin turned the order inward, Solis Moral was quite cooperative about studies regarding the claw that was unearthed beneath the Zenith Citadel. Considering all that has happened, it is no longer only our scholars and historians that need to know more.
Ishel took a steadying sigh that threatened an unwelcoming wave of dizziness. Fate! Carrying a child and the burden of grand illumination was already proving taxing. Though she hated what would have to come next, she had already explained that knowledge would have to be shared. It would all be wasted if that policy was failed. She seated herself and gave Moral a concerned look of warning.
I am going to be forthcoming, your majesties, and likely more so has been true for centuries. We found the vault of the grand illumination.
The barons muttered in an incoherent stir that echoed in the dining hall. The sound would have belonged to an open council arena.
Though the majority of us knew almost as little as everyone else, it seems my predecessors and their selected advisors knew the truth about demonic interactions with Provis, at least as far back as 2 millennia.
The din of chatter raised, and Ishel allowed it to pass before continuing. Even after witnessing recent events as everyone had, this was still a lot to take in. Here among kings, queens, and their governors, Ishel accepted that the role of any member of the order was to advise and inform. They would take whatever time they needed to absorb this. Thea broke the commotion by raising one hand above the table, without looking away from its surface.
So then, the barrier around my ruined port city?
Ishel nodded solemnly.
Light Moral told me that there is an art of high spirit mastery, which converts both the body and spirit into an immutable force. This you already know, but all evidence points to a vague resurgence of the Void Hands. It seems they were trapped within the barrier to halt their advance.
That seems to have failed, your radiance,
Talek observed, his blue eyes hard as he leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled hands.
While none of us can be less grateful for our survival around the Cassarans, our benefactor has left us with lingering doubts about our safety. Talek,
Malaric growled.
No, old bear. As much as some of us might wish to, we cannot ignore this. A void hand was observed during the eclipse. I will not overlook the rumors of who did this, and none of that makes sense. But there are many strange things happening. Before we blindly place our trust in the Order as we once did, or the Earth Phoenix clan, my people and I must have answers!
Talek Senis, please, Barain interjected. The Order has ever been our benefactor.
Not in all instances. It was your husband and Delkit that first met the Cassaran threat, and they did so alone.
Talek stood up and directed his attention to Zenrik.
2 nights ago, an inn and several homes were assaulted by an unknown phantom. Catan was lost to void hands. When you put it all together, we place ourselves in uncertain times.
Isha was ready to speak, but her own father chimed in.
As part of the people you're all sworn to protect, I would like to place a word in on the matter. Your Majesty of Terrell.
Talek was briefly stunned, blinking several times, but he nodded.
Very well, Master Smith. If times are uncertain, then perhaps it is better to have the Order among us as they proposed. Much like your own steel against coming invaders and marauders. Only the Order can stand against those nightmares. Would you want your weapons so far from reach if an assassin stood above your bed?
Talek mulled this over, his conflict plain, and he considered the past and the present in equal turns. At last he seated himself, but he was not finished.
2,000 years ago, this kingdom was ruled by Len's cousins, the Terrells. The Senis family took the throne, but only because the Terrells were wiped out. The Terrell family trusted in the presence of the Earth Phoenix clan. In the end, it was not enough to protect their dynasty. I, and my people, need greater certainty than was offered to the Terrell family. It was a boy of the Order who managed to vanquish this strange assailant, Your Majesty.
Zenrik added cautiously. Talek sighed.
I am aware, Baron Len, as this happened in your barony, and you still speak on behalf of the Order. I must ask what you believe to be reasonable provisions to this agreement to prevent a tragic repeat of events.
But it was the almost Catani-looking Cerinthia that spoke in answer. They establish a chapter house as they continue to investigate these occurrences, and provide us all with answers. We reserve the right to assign a neutral observer to the chapter houses, and make sure all is as it should be. Talek nodded and rubbed his auburn beard vigorously.
Fair terms, Baroness Len. It seems they're conditions that will allow them to earn our trust over time.
It was a simple condition, but Isha knew that there would be more to it later. She expected that Talek might insist on monitoring how many lights they recruited at any given time. Chapter 15. Rylan was pleased with the location of the home he would share with Aimreen. It was a spacious glade filled with wildflowers and long, frosty green grasses that caressed his hips and thighs. The circling tree line of towering redwoods formed a solid line that took the shape of an eye. The image was accentuated by a large, cracked limestone block in the center of the clearing. The redwoods ran in a thick forest in all directions. Their ancient boughs obscured their jagged foothills to the north, leaving only the pointed spires and cliffs to emerge high above. Most of this was hidden now. It was late in the cold autumn night. The sky was filled with a breathtaking canopy of diamond dust starlight, uninterrupted by any glow from Provis below. The forest animals had long since sought nightly warmth in the tree hollows and deep burrows. It would have been absolute silence if not for the runoff of a wide river, coursing its way west from the high in the mountain range. Rylan closed his eyes and savored the sound of a bubbling shallows directly to the west. His breath misted in front of his face, promising the imminent arrival of a long, cold winter. The rivers would soon freeze at night, not long before the first snowfall. Rylan projected a wave of quickened, endless current through his body, creating a ripple of relaxing warmth as it passes through him. There was much to do, and it would be a waste of time to spend the long, cold night huddled in his green coat. Rylan looked at the forest appreciatively. The redwoods spent the last 2 millennia in growth, and he had no desire to end that now. He had spent much time among the polymancers, and he was grateful for that. They taught him how to craft various forms of wood and stone from raw energy and vibrations. Rylan's thoughts slipped away in the sound of the rushing water. The tranquility of the forest and the glade filled his being. With it came the roaring force of the endless current. It burned and seared inside of him. Still, though not as heavily pronounced as before, he pushed the raw force into the gleaming length of his displacement staff.
The emerald emitted a steadily growing green light that surrounded him. The golden numerals at the end flared with a fiery heat and dripped with a shower of eldritch sparks. They faded and vanished before they could cause a grass fire. Ryland stretched his mind and awareness to the edges of the clearing before he raised his staff. He brought the butt end down in a hard slam. A rippling wave of energy passed to the edges of the clearing. The grasses rustled in a unified whisper as it passed. Ryland jammed the end of his staff into the damp soil before he knelt to scoop a handful of cold, wet dirt at the roots of the grass. He stood up and circled his free hand in swirls over his closed fist. An en gras, natalmain, the me. Sered, meoracad, lornadacad. He opened his fist and blew a gust filled with endless current. The dirt immediately swirled to take 6 duplicate shapes of himself. He might not have bothered with fully shaping the dust mimics, but he was not sure how far his new limits reached. He wanted to reserve his strength for all his work he had to do this night. They gathered the endless current and began shaping small blocks of dark granite and lengths of redwood. Ryland's abilities with polymancy were always better than his prowess with the basic elements. The truth was plain. Even as he watched the duplicates at work, his dust mimics functioned in a lesser capacity of his own skill. Each piece of material required at least 10 minutes of shaping. If not for the displacement field reducing the amount of time required for every action, Ryland would not have so much as half of a home constructed several days from now. Yet, there was still a way to finish this much sooner. It might tax him to a much larger degree, especially with so many other spell shapes at work. But he had already successfully performed the master-level Chronomancy shape multifold displacement several times since his duel with Xenon Roll. Ryland thought no more of it. He wanted to hold Aimrine through the night as soon as possible. He concentrated on the linear energies of the temporal current. His hands traced glowing green lines, creating dozens of 3-dimensional shapes, surrounding each with a series of complex mathematical equations. His voice hummed a monotone mix of languages and countdowns. It was easier to contend with than the nauseating sense of vertigo as he concentrated the area into a radius of 10 feet around him. Ryland's awareness was only 5 places at the same moment. The dust mimics continued to transmute materials with only 4 of the alternate Ryland's turn to greet him. The 5th alternate stood with his back turned. Words remained trapped in Ryland's throat as he was baffled. Every alternate Ryland in a multifold displacement shared in all things with him, including awareness of all the possible risks and failures of the spell shapes. Defiance was not one of them. It was never recorded in any surviving tome of the Golden Hourglass clan. In fact, Ryland's perception could not reach through this alternate. The endless and temporal current did not flow to it either, as it did with even the dust mimics. Ryland hesitated with his brow furrowed for a moment longer before he tapped the strange alternate on the shoulder. The voice that responded, as cold and hollow as it sounded, seeped with icy rage. Not all things are as they seem, Ryland to care. The title and name were emphasized with disgust and contempt. The alternate turned. Ryland watched it occur in slow motion as fury and dread warred in his belly. The fibers of the alternate's coat changed to light-eating black, one by one, as though each thread was soaked in oil. The hairs on the back of Ryland's neck and arms stood on end with their own unified response. The sounds of laboring dust mimics in the river's shallows faded to a blunt, pressuring silence. The alternate's feet lifted off the ground as his clothes continued to lose all color. His face and arms came into view. His skin was ashen and clammy, while candle tongues of icy black fire burst in fits all over his body. His lips and fingernails were the pallor of a drowned corpse. His eyes were devoid of any color, leaving only tiny black pupils in milky white. Ryland held out his hand and reached with his will. His displacement staff whipped loudly through the air, end over end, spinning over its weighty grip. To think my loving wife believes I could ever forget my mistakes, Ryland quipped acidly. Negistris's counter was cold and flat. She would have to, as you repeat the same tragedies again and again. Your friend is married. and with child. Ryland looked at him with confusion as he began recounting obvious events. She claims the mantle of grand illumination, as Provis readies itself to move into an age of golden prosperity. Kings and queens meet, reconciling with their vices and shortcomings so that their people may live better lives. The Order will soon initiate more lights than it has since its inception 2 millennia ago. Negistris's eyes filled to the edge with opaque, inky blackness. A wide swath of ground beneath him split, and a thick current of sulfuric purple hellfire blasted into the sky. Screams of agony from Epphleos poured out of the demonic rift. Cries of terror from dozens of lost wandering ghosts filled the night sky from the forest. Negistris formed the Staff of the Abyss at double the speed of Ryland's current reactions. The Chronomancer barely had his weapon in ready defense when Created End dashed and slammed into an oppressive swipe that placed the staff dangerously close to Ryland's throat. Negistris pushed heavily, leaning into his attack with his face only inches from Ryland's. Ryland's throat burned with the cold of 100 piercing daggers, as hell frost spread into a crackling frigid layer over his neck. The disdain was clear on countenance of the Void Disciple's sneering cold blue lips. I grant you back your unhindered powers, pathetic magus. Negistris hissed acidly. I will claim recompense when I see fit. Created shoved harder, causing Ryland to stumble back. When he straightened to defend himself, Negistris was gone. The brimstone, the hellfire, all of it absent, as though it was all a dream. Ryland let his staff fall as he sagged out of breath with trembling hands. The alternate Rylands were gone, while the dust mimics continued to labor as though nothing happened. He allowed himself a nervous chuckle before he fell back into the long grasses howling with laughter. He lay spread eagle, cackling madly. Amrine's thoughts and feelings of concern flooded in on Ryland. When had the senses of her being stopped coming to him? That was disconcerting. Ryland then remembered the old superstition that those who dreamed of void hands were fated to insanity. When he had the dream vision of the captured void hands being executed, he dismissed the folktale warning. Now, he began to wonder about it. Amrine's presence was a soothing embrace on the cold hand that pressed on his mind. The determination of her love held him tight. It won't happen, my love. I will hold your spirit close and never let you slip away. Ryland calmed his laughter and closed his eyes against the chilled night. He felt the absence of the essence of stillness and knew that Negistris had been true to his word. But why? And what would Created End demand in return? It was the same dark night, only a few hours before dawn. On a lattice workbench in the courtyards of the Arc-like compound, Moral intruded on Maurice's solitude. He tossed a small leather journal onto an empty space on the bench beside Maurice. Maurice looked down at it. Even without the bright glow of his current sphere posts, the Elomancer already knew what the book was. He looked up at the archivist. Moral did not bring his staff, and that let Moral fold his arms and look at Maurice with accusation and expectation. To Maurice's credit, he maintained a false display of being dumbfounded. So you don't recognize it, Light Maurice? Moral challenged without waiting for an answer. Well, that is not alarming. It has only been out of the vault a few weeks, and it has never left my personal study. Then I confess my confusion, Spark Moral. What is this about? In answer, Moral shaped a concentrated gust of wind on the journal. Maurice looked on with a pretense of surprise. He already knew what page would be opened in the book. He knew the written and inherited instruction well enough to perform them from memory. The 5-element banishing is a ritual that is passed from one Elomancer to the next, Moral began. It is a low-component ritual developed during the time of the Supreme Radiance clan, but they believed that seldom had need for it. Its premier application is removing demons from the world. It rips away the fear, the pain, and the souls they gathered, which leaves the demons helpless to maintain their existence against the endless currents. Moral sat down.
What I find particularly interesting was the last time its use was recorded. I found that his Radiance, like Elysian, secretly used that ritual at the end of the Malkinor inquiry to purge a demon from an abandoned estate. It was mentioned almost in passing, which made it easy to miss. He wrote down his entire tenure, it seems. He never instructed any light in the five-element banishing, even while an Chronomancer was always there. So, if not from a book, or its last known practitioner, how then did you acquire this knowledge?
Maurice looked at Moral, staring into his eyes, fully prepared to do as his teachers demanded.
It was like the sunlight on the field all those years ago, Spark Moral. I felt seized with action I cannot explain. I was moved.
Moral raised a suspicious eyebrow with scrutiny, but he slouched on the bench and sighed.
And perhaps that is how the ritual was born to begin with. Elumancy is always so difficult to anticipate.
He rubbed his short, fair, lightly brown hair wearily.
And you leave us in a hurried panic because you are a faster study than most recorded Elumancers in the past 7 centuries. Should I be hearing this, Spark Moral?
Maurice knew it was an unspoken taboo among Sparks to tell their students what kind of strength they held. Moral blinked against the evident fatigue that sat up.
I suppose not. You should go and rest, Light Maurice.
Maurice stood up and walked to the sleeping quarters with obedient speed. His bowels churned with regret for having lied to Moral. He could only pray in silence that all the deception and secrecy was enough to protect all his brothers and sisters in the Order.